Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're going to take a hard look at the future of Total War 3 Kingdoms. Yes, I know, the new Faith Divided DLC was just announced and not even released yet, so why am I doing a speculation video on future DLCs? Well, first off, as a content partner of Creative Assembly, I am blessed to have access to DLCs before they are released, but I'm also subject to non-disclosure agreements where I can't share anything I know until certain embargo periods. Therefore, now is probably the best time for me to speculate, since I can honestly say that I have no insider knowledge about any future DLCs. More importantly, in my latest Fates Divided announcement trailer breakdown video, I promised to make this speculation video if it got over 1,000 likes, and since that took less than 12 hours, so I guess we're going to have some fun speculating today. Now, before we get into the pure speculations, there are a few facts that CA has shared publicly that not everyone is aware of. First, the next DLC will be an expansion pack, similar to the Furious Wild. It will be focused on the north. It should be launched in the second half of this year, and as with the Furious Wild DLC, this one will cost $19.99 USD and include new subcultures and a map expansion along with some map updates to fix some of the geographic errors on the current map. Now we know this because CA has shared some of this in the AMA last year throughout their forums and on Reddit, and it was also in the patch note for the Furious Wild where they acknowledged some of the current errors on the map and how they will fix it in a future update, which was confirmed on the AMAs to be the Northern Expansion Pack. Now, since this was a while ago, and as with anything else in life, things can change, but I'm fairly certain, like 99% sure, that the Northern Expansion Pack will happen, and it will be the next DLC. Simply because CA is very attentive to community feedback, and the majority of the community here wants the new subculture that might introduce exotic nomadic cavalry units or cool units like wolf handlers, which surprisingly they already made for the Furious Wild before scrapping it, because if you look into the pack folders, you can actually find wolf handlers as a unit. And this demand for this type of expansion pack is a reflection on the Total War 3 Kingdoms community at large. You see, for the most part, the Total War 3 Kingdoms community can be subdivided into two categories. First, there are the Total War fans, who got introduced to the Three Kingdoms time period through the game, and then there are the Three Kingdom fans, who got introduced to Total War games for the first time. Of course, there are the super lucky fans like myself, who found out back in 2018 that one of my favorite gaming franchises is going to make a game set in one of my favorite time periods, which led to the creation of this very YouTube channel. But this also means that these groups here will have different visions for the future of Total War 3 Kingdoms, and that is a tough thing for CA to balance when developing DLCs for the game. For the most part, the first group here, or the core Total War fans, who have played a ton of Total War games in the past and are likely to be more active in online Total War communities, they see Total War 3 Kingdoms as any other game in the franchise, where DLCs are centered around new cultures or new lords. And this makes a lot of sense for games like Warhammer or Rome, where new playable factions were the main selling point for each DLC. Or perhaps if we looked at Shogun 2, which was the last historical title based in the Orient, their DLCs offered completely different scenarios with completely different factions that used the same map, but at a different time period. And for a time, it looked like Three Kingdoms was going to follow in these same developmental footsteps. First, we had the Yellow Turban DLC on launch, which included a new subculture in the Yellow Turbans, with 3 new playable factions. Then, about 3 months after launch, 8 Princes was released, which is exactly like the Fall of the Samurai, as it was this DLC that used the same map in a different time period with completely different factions in the different scenario. But 8 Princes flopped, and received a lot of community backlash because it failed to make either group of the fans happy. For Total War fans, the DLC seems like a copy and paste job of the main game, with many of the factions sharing the same mechanics while offering far less unique generals to take advantage of the character-based features of the core game. And for the second group of fans, who are fans of Three Kingdom time period, they felt betrayed, as they had just spent $60 buying a Three Kingdoms game 3 months prior, and all of a sudden, it seemed like all future support for the Three Kingdoms time period was over before it even started. as the first post-launch DLC made a 100-year time jump to the Jin Dynasty, which ended the Three Kingdoms. So I think this is when CA shifted their DLC strategies, as the original strategy was probably, let's make 8 princes for Jin, which symbolizes the end of the Three Kingdom, and then make the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which symbolizes the beginning, much like how the Rise and Fall of Samurai DLC sandwiched Shogun 2. Of course, Mandate of Heaven still happened, but if you all remember, that DLC was delayed for quite a while, as I'm sure CA made many adjustments in order to not make the same mistake as 8 Princes. And when it finally did launch, it introduced the idea of the timeline in the game. And this is when the core game was rebranded as the 190 Rise of the Warlord start, as Rise of the Warlord was not a term before this. Now, Mandate of Heaven definitely appeased both groups, as the first group saw the introduction of more Yellow Turban subcultures with different mechanics, and on top of that, we got the traditional 2 new faction or Lord Pack DLC structure commonly used in Warhammer, with the introduction of Lu Zhi and Liu Chong, who each had very interesting mechanics and cool faction unique units. And for the fans of Three Kingdom, people rejoiced because almost all the Three Kingdom games used the Yellow Turban as a starting point, while CA had used Dongzhuo in 190 as theirs. So Mandate of Heaven provided a better starting point, while also adding a multitude of familiar characters to enrich the game. Then very soon, a World Betray expanded on this timeline chapter pack idea, which is unique to Three Kingdoms, while also following the 2 new faction structure, with Lü Bu and Sun Ce. As a matter of fact, I personally never expected 194 to become a chapter pack in the game, as when they announced the chapter pack structure, I had envisioned the jump to Guandu right away, as Guandu was this huge event that followed the downfall of Dongzhuo that would shape the rest of the Three Kingdoms story. And I was very surprised when CA was making this DLC with only a 4-year gap on the timeline. But in hindsight, I think CA saw the opportunity to feature 2 new factions in Lü Bu and Sun Ce, who are both very popular figures from the Three Kingdoms time period, and they just went for it, since it could appease both the core Total War fans who are familiar with this 2 new faction structure, as well as historical Three Kingdom fans. Even though historically speaking, nothing major really happens in 194 in the grand scheme of things. But because CA went with this 2 new faction structure again here, many fans, especially from the first group, who are very used to this 2 new faction type of DLC structure, are now expecting this to be the case for all future chapter packs, when in fact, this is not what chapter packs are about. And to make things worse, the next DLC that was released was The Furious Wild, which is the first expansion pack for the series. And this was something that the first group particularly liked because now we're adding new things in the game. New subculture, new units, new generals, elephants, tigers. And for the second group, the Three Kingdom fans here don't mind the Nanman, as the Nanman Rebellion was one the highlight of Zhuge Liang's career, and since almost all Three Kingdom fans have been brainwashed at least once by the romance of Three Kingdom, the Nanman were always going to be this welcomed addition, because everything Shu touches turns to gold. But in terms of gameplay, the Nanman experience is rather limited for the fans of the second group, simply because no Three Kingdom fans are dreaming about conquering China as Meng Huo. It is as if you're a Civil War fan, but you're playing the Native Americans and have them conquer both the North and the South. And as cool as that sounds, this type of historical impossibility will get old and really lack replayability. But the cool factor is definitely there. And I think The Furious Wild definitely helped drive the sale of the game as a whole. So as a fan who wants to see long-term support for Total War 3 Kingdoms, I'm very happy about the success of The Furious Wild. However, that success creates a problem of expectations when the latest DLC here shifts back to a chapter pack. And different from all the previous DLCs, Fates Divided does not follow the 2 new faction structure, as it mainly features 2 reworks of existing factions, and technically only 1 new faction locked behind the paywall, as Liu Yan is now part of a DLC instead of a free LC, and there's no free LC this time. So this creates a problem for a lot of the fans. but I think this is the only thing they could have done, for two reasons. First, if Liu Yan is a free LC, then this DLC becomes almost pointless for people who don't care about the history of Three Kingdoms, because they would not care about having a 200 start, and all the rework for Cao Cao and Yuan Shao can be part of the free patch. So if you want to experience all the newness, you just need to play Cao Cao and Yuan Shao in 190 for free starting on March 11th once you downloaded the patch, without buying the DLC at all. Therefore, CA needed to lock at least one new thing behind the paywall, and this new thing was Liu Yan. And this is also why Liu Yan probably has those cool looking shoulder pads, and why he's featured on the cover art of the DLC, even though he is long dead historically by the year 200. And this brings us to the second reason why we find ourselves in this situation, and that's because CA is way too generous with their free patches. Since the launch of the game, the base game has received all the new items, new generals, new mechanics for free in each of the patches that accompany a DLC launch. Almost 2 years later, the game is in such a better state today compared to launch in terms of just the base game. So if you're ever turned off from buying Total War 3 Kingdoms because of the number of DLCs you see in the store, don't. Just grab the base game on sale the next opportunity you get, because the mechanics such as Imperial Courts, Bandit reworks, map updates, all the new generals, all the new units, the upcoming reworks to Faction Council, the Emperor rework, as well as any small tweaks or major overhauls to existing faction mechanic are all included for free. So honestly, it's pretty crazy that on top of all these updates we get all the time, we still get free playable factions with all the past DLCs. But no one really hates free things. So I do hope future DLCs after Fate Divided would continue to support free LCs. And speaking of future DLCs, that's why we're here. So let me start listing the ones I hope we will get in the future. Now, not all these chapter packs will happen. In the end, I'll put a timeline out of the realistic ones that I think will happen and when we might get them. But for now, let me have some fun and list out all the ones I want to see. First, after the year 200. I think the next chapter pack date will take place in the year 207. This is the year Cao Cao finally wraps up his firm control of the north by beating Ta Dun, who is the chief of the Wuhan tribes, and Gongsun Kang, who is Gongsun Du's son, will also execute Yuan Shang and Yuan Xi, which officially ends the Yuan clan in the north. At the same time, Liu Chan, Liu Bei's son, is finally born, and Zhuge Liang officially joins Liu Bei, who is ready in the Jin province as a guest of Liu Biao. Now, of course, picking this date helps wraps up the scene set in Fates Divided, as we will get to see the tail end of Cao Cao's northern push, and bring up the potential final showdown between the northern nomadic factions that might be introduced in the northern expansion pack that we mentioned earlier, as well as introduce some new characters to the north. Gongsun Du and his son Gongsun Kang will likely become yet another cross-generation faction mechanic player similar to Liu Yan and Liu Zhang. And while you might not think Gongsun Kang's introduction here is important, he is required if we ever want to see a Korean subculture added into the game through some sort of expansion pack, which I do not think will happen with the northern expansion pack. I think the Korean subculture, if it ever will be added as expansion pack, will get its own expansion pack, as Gongsun Kang and the Korean kingdoms will start going to war starting in 209. But of course, the real reason anyone want to see 207 is that it becomes a great date to set up for the Battle of Chibi, which takes place in 208. And this is the pivotal showdown in the south, the most important battle during the entire Three Kingdom period, where Cao Cao tried to unify the country by going to war with the combined alliance of Sun Quan and Liu Bei. And his defeat here would create the divide that will eventually set up the Three Kingdoms. And thus, we will end up having our second new faction in Sun Quan, who will likely get his own unique faction mechanic, new portrait for the second generation of Wu officers, with the likes of Lu Su, Lu Meng, and so much more, as well as some more unique units for him, as he will definitely be the star of this DLC. And if I had to guess what free DLC would make sense for this start, then I would put my money on Huangzu. as Sun Quan would avenge his father's death in the early stages of 208 when he launches a campaign against Huangzu that would see his death. And I think Huangzu will make for a good addition in the free LC scene, since he does play a pivotal role in most of the southern conflicts in the early stage of the Three Kingdom period. He kills Sun Jian and did battle with both Sun Ce and Sun Quan, and had powerful generals like Gan Ning under his command. So he would make for quite a nice free LC edition that would perhaps focus on certain vassal mechanic that is not often seen in Total War games. Then for the next chapter pack, I want the year 211 to be made, as this is the year that Ma Chao and Han Sui would rebel against Cao Cao out west. So we can finally see Ma Chao take over his father's faction and become one of the stars in this chapter pack, as he will surely get his own faction, get a cooler faction mechanic, and maybe some more units. Then in the Shu region, in this same year, Liu Zhang would invite Liu Bei to come into Shu. So Liu Bei would finally move into his historical region and become a star for this DLC as well, as he deserves a much needed faction revamp for his mechanic, since at this point there would not be much Han territory for him to use his unity on. So much like how Cao Cao would get the revamp in Fates Divided, and Sun Quan would star in the Tribute 207 chapter pack, Liu Bei would finally get his refresh here in 211. Elsewhere on the map, Sun Quan's also busy vassalizing Shi Xie in this year, before launching an attack on Cao Cao. And for free LCs, the simple choice here would be Han Sui, as he gets to finally join the fray as both a feature faction alongside Ma Chao in their war against Cao Cao, and also become playable in the base game 190, which seems like the base requirement for a free LC. Then after the 211 chapter pack, the dates becomes a little tougher to pick because they become a little bit more unrealistic. For myself, I want to see 215 made, since in 215, Sun Quan started the year off by going to war with Liu Bei for the Jin province, before ending the year leading his infamous 100,000 man assault on Hefei, where Zhang Liao, Yue Jin, and Li Dian repelled him with just 800 men. And out west, Cao Cao also attacked Zhang Lu, leading to his surrender, which can finally introduce Zhang Lu as a playable faction into the game. And in the following year, Cao Cao would also wage one final war with the southern Xiongnu tribes, which would see the capture of their chieftain and the forced separation of the southern Xiongnu tribe into 5 weaker and smaller tribes. So in terms of action across the map, there's plenty of it. But in terms of new feature factions, there is not much to offer. And the only way I see this chapter pack ever being made is if they make Zhang Lu into something like Liu Yan, where he is locked behind a paywall, and they make a rework of the Yellow Turban feature that would allow some sort of Han integration, as Zhang Lu was this Taoist faction that ruled like the Yellow Turbans. Now, what's more likely is that Zhang Lu does not get made here and becomes a free LC down the line, and that's probably what will more realistically happen. And speaking of realistic chapter pack dates, I think we'll get definitely a chapter pack around 220, as this is the pivotal point that will form the Three Kingdoms. Now, I debated a lot about how CA will approach this moment, as a lot of things also happen in 219. For example, in 219, Liu Bei attacks Cao Cao in Hanzhong, while Guan Yu attacks Cao Cao in the Jin province. And what we get is the pinnacle of Shu Han before this great fall, as Guan Yu will soon be backstabbed by Sun Quan, causing Liu Bei to lose all his holdings in the Jin province, and the death of Guan Yu. And it'd be a shame to not be able to play any of these moments and only see the aftermath. But I think CA might go with 220 if they want to introduce Cao Pi as his own faction, as Cao Cao would die in 220. But I think the perfect solution here is to just let Cao Pi inherit Cao Cao's mechanic, since it's getting so good in Fates Divided. And that way we can have the 219 chapter pack where you can experience all those pinnacle moments of Liu Bei and Shu Han before they fell. So I think that's probably the way to go here, but we'll have to see. And then after 219, there's a few choices of when to pick dates going forward that might see some new factions added into the game. For example, in 223, Liu Bei would die, giving way to Liu Shan as his own faction. And then in 226, Cao Pi would die, giving away to Cao Rui as a new faction. But I think if we put those events together, as them by themselves is not really worthy of a chapter pack, we can jump ahead to about 228. That's when Zhuge Liang started launching his northern expeditions, where he went on these military campaigns against the kingdom of Wei. And in this chapter pack, we could see Cao Rui and Liu Chan getting their own faction mechanic as the star of the DLC. Well, I really want to see Zhuge Liang played out very differently here. I actually want him to become his own faction, but not just any regular faction. I want him to be a vassal horde faction. Now, hear me out. So vassal horde faction means he's a vassal to Liu Chan. He's a horde faction means he can't have any of his own land. So he's always on this military campaign. He can still build buildings inside his army, like a tent, similar to how Penthethilia's horde faction works in Total War Troy. And all the land that he would conquer would instantly go to Liu Chan. And the more successful his campaigns are, the more reward he get from his liege. So in this way, we can go the historical route of having Zhuge Liang focus on these northern expeditions while having him never betray Liu Chan, because that would go against his faction mechanic, which in my opinion would be a great treatment of how to experience the northern expeditions, given the limitations of the game. Then after this point, we can only hope for something like a 249 chapter pack, centered around Sima Yi's coup. But this might be truly wishful thinking, simply because I'm not sure if Three Kingdoms will get this long of a sustained support from CA, because just from my speculations here, we're talking about roughly 5 more chapter packs, and I also envision anywhere from 2 to 4 expansion pack slotted in between, so that's going to put us at 7 to 9 more DLCs. And even if we stay on the record-setting pace of 3 DLCs a year from last year, which is extremely optimistic, that would put Three Kingdoms support cycle to 5 years, which would be amazing, but highly unlikely. Even Warhammer 2 is only getting 4 years of support, as Warhammer 3 is launching later this year. So maybe we'll never get to see this connection to 8 Princes DLC, but here's to wishful thinking. Now, we still haven't talked about expansion pack, which as you can see from the map here, will expand the game map and also introduce all of these subcultures that could potentially surround the Three Kingdoms to enrich the game. And the only thing we talked about so far is that we will get a northern expansion pack right away. And I think the focus of this expansion pack will be limited to the Xiongnu and Wuhuan tribes in the north, since they will become most relevant to the existing slate of chapter packs. After all, it makes no sense to introduce new factions that do not historically interact with any of the other existing factions on the map. Then, after the 207 chapter pack, we'll probably see a Korea expansion pack, since it is probably going to sell extremely well among the Korean community, which is not surprisingly a huge community for Total War 3 Kingdom, and from a historical perspective, it would at least make sense, as Gongsun Kang would become playable in the 207 chapter pack prior to this. And that way we can have the interaction between him and the Korean subculture. And I believe the fanbase subculture, which is around this region too, would get introduced as well, since they already have units represented in the game. Then finally, I think we'll see a Qiang expansion pack following the 211 chapter pack, as Ma Chao's introduction, as well as Han Sui being added as a free LC, could see some rework of the Qiang subculture, since they already have a lot of units represented in the game, and perhaps we can see some Western expansions to the game map. Now, there's also the possibility that we'll get a Yue or pirate theme expansion pack somewhere down the line to flush out the South a little bit more, especially after Sun Quan established himself. But since they're probably the least historically relevant group out of the ones we have listed so far, I wouldn't mind if they never happen, as I prefer more chapter packs over more expansion packs, which I know many people might find confusing. And many people probably wonder, why do we need all these chapter packs when some of the later ones especially will not be getting any new factions to play with? And perhaps from a financial perspective, you're right, they might never get made. But I think the best way to explain my desire for more chapter packs and not more expansion packs is that since this is a historical sandbox game, chapter packs provides the best historical experiences. Say you are playing a World War II sandbox game, which would be a more modern and worldwide setting, so hopefully it'll be more relatable for everyone. And the game decides to pick the traditional invasion of Poland for the starting date. At this point, Germany and USSR are allies. The US is not in the war, and China and Japan have already been fighting for years. But more importantly, pivotal moments in history that are well remembered, like Dunkirk, the invasion of Britain, the betrayal of USSR by Germany, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, will all never happen in the game, since this is a sandbox game. So you start with the invasion of Poland, everything after is random in the game. So if you're playing a game like that and it's a World War II game, you're going to feel that it severely lacks essential content. Therefore, chapter packs allow players to experience these pivotal moments. Sometimes these chapter packs will introduce new factions. For example, if you have a Pearl Harbor chapter pack, then the US suddenly becomes a playable faction, and that's great. But this doesn't mean that we should skip a D-Day chapter pack simply because D-Day will add no new factions. And in this scenario, expansion packs are like adding Ethiopia as a new subculture to fight the Italians in North Africa. Sure, it's sort of historical, and it definitely sounds exciting, and I'm not using Ethiopia as an example to degrade their contribution to World War II, but you get what I mean when all I see after the announcement of Faith Divided is that there's nothing new in this chapter pack, and especially from a lot of the other English content creators that I know, they're simply asking for where are the nomadic tribes. Well, if you really want to play nomadic tribes, then try Attila. Or if you want a Lost Legion DLC added to Three Kingdoms, maybe go play Rome. Like, you can't be the same people that complain about how generals in romance mode ruins the historical integrity of the game, but then ask for outlandish expansion pack ideas at the same time. Now, I'm not against expansion packs, as they probably make more money than chapter packs, and if anything, they will attract new players, and this money will end up helping make more chapter packs down the line. So at the end of the day, I'm all for more content and support for Total War 3 Kingdom. And if only half of the DLC on this timeline here gets made, I will still be a very happy man. And if you want to ask me which of these DLCs I'm most looking forward to, my answer is always going to be the next one. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the speculation video, and as a reminder, tomorrow the preview period for the Faith Divided DLC will start, so come back and we'll start previewing the game, and I can't wait to do that with you guys. So until then, bye!